And Yuri is going to be talking about the sacred wells and well maidens of this land here. So let's welcome Yuri. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tor. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, cool. I get quite uncomfortable with microphones. So I'm going to bring things back to the Arthurian legends. This is a legends conference, and Sue Wallace, in her talk, talked about the importance of water and the sanctuary of water, and that lovely thing that Peter said about we drink the same water dinosaurs drank and all the rest of it. So the most common story people know about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are they seek the Holy Grail. And that was first written about by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, beginning of the 12th century. Now, not a lot of people know why the knights are looking for the Holy Grail in the first place. And the reason they're hunting, questing for the Holy Grail, is to restore the wasteland. The land has become a wasteland, infertile, nothing will grow, and people are sick. So the Grail is needed to restore this wasteland, and that's the whole importance of it. Now, not many people know why there's a wasteland in the first place. Okay? So in the early 1200s, a poem was written by an anonymous person, but it was written as an introduction to Chrétien de Troyes' story about Percival and the Holy Grail. It was the first explanation of the Grail and restoring the wasteland. And I cut it very short. So you can look it up on the internet yourself. The poem in English is called The Elucidation. So you can go and Google The Elucidation and read it for yourself. It's a fairly long poem, and it explains that once upon a time, the land was healthy and vibrant and fertile, and there were maidens of the wells, the well maidens. And any knight or pilgrim or traveller travelling around the world or the land could go to a well maiden and get water and nutrition and maybe stay the night or just be looked after. In a way, symbolically, the land is looking after the people by these divine spirits of the sacred wells. The well maidens were not human. They were something fairy, something other, an eternal spirit of place, like a goddess of the land. So the story, after explaining that, then explains how a bad king comes along and he rapes one of the well maidens. And then he encourages his men to rape the other well maidens. This is all in that poem, The Elucidation. And after they've been raped, what it says in the poem is that the maidens of the wells took their golden cups and left. And when they left, the land became a wasteland. Now, this story kind of goes right back to ancient Mesopotamia when the goddess Ishtar, Inanna, when she goes down into the other world, nothing will recreate. Animals won't reproduce. Nature dies. So the gods call her back from the underworld because you need that divine feminine thing in the landscape. So back to King Arthur and his knights seeking the Grail. On the Grail quests, they encounter maidens in distress, and that gets watered down into chivalry and gallantry and Rapunzel, let down your hair, and those kind of naive stories. But the Elucidation explains that all of the women that the Knights of the Round Table encounter are the descendants of the well maidens, and that actually the knights questing the Grail are trying to call back the well maidens to the land. Their golden cups come back with them and stuff. So that's an introduction to the sacredness of water and our relationship with water and how detached we are from it now. On the whole, most people think drinking water comes from a tap, which it never used to. So anywhere there was fresh drinking water was life, literally. Without it, things died. So many years ago, I was in Glastonbury about 20 years. I left in 2018, but I was involved in a group of people called the Maltwood Moot, and we would work with the sacred landscape of what's known as the Glastonbury Zodiac. It's a big area. The circumference is 30 miles. So there's many towns and villages, rivers, waterfalls, churches and hill forts in this sacred landscape. And one of the meetings we had, some of the women in the Maltwood Moot were going to start looking at the pools and the streams and the sacred water areas of the Glastonbury Zodiac. And they were aware of this story. So in their own way, they were going to call back the well maidens. And they were going to do flower essences and things at different water locations. With that idea at hand, myself and a friend called Elen, we thought we'd go back to the source of two rivers. There's two main rivers that go through this landscape thing. And so it's a long-winded way of presenting to you today things I found by following the source of the River Brue and looking at things along its route, if you like, you know. And with sacred landscape, we're all guilty of it a bit. We project onto it what we want it to be. We project a legend onto it or whatever. What's really difficult is to go somewhere and just listen, to kind of strip away any pre-ideas and just listen to the landscape and what memories it holds. So some of this is some of that. There's a nice idea from the ancient world that fire and smoke rises. It's like yin and yang. Fire and smoke rise. So that was a way of sending prayers up to the spirit world. And in polarity to that, water will always find its way down. And so listening at a holy well or sacred spring is listening to the reply of the request. You know, so one is the ego sending upwards. The listening to the water is listening to the memory of the world, you know, the anima mundi, or soul of the world. So another thing, quickly, is that a lot of this that I'm about to talk about is Roman, and I get itchy with that too. But the importance of the Roman history is it's an echo of what the Celts and Druids were doing beforehand. So we have to look through a Roman filter to see what was going on in the landscape beforehand. And also when you're looking at King Arthur, Merlin, Taliesin, these are people of the 5th and 6th centuries. They are the descendants of Romano-British culture. So understanding a kind of Romanized Celtic, Romano-Celtic, Romano-British spirituality. We get a glimpse of the pre-Roman Celtic people and an understanding of the Dark Age people that were King Arthur, Merlin, and Taliesin, and so on. So this is our immediate area. Here we have the River Severn, Caerleon, Sea Mills, which is Bristol, Bath, and then there's this famous, not so famous, but it will be, ancient forest that was known to the Britons as Coit-Moor, the Great Forest. Coit-Moor is just Brythonic for Great Forest. The Romans called it Silva Magna. Silva Magna means the Great Forest. It's just a Latin version of Coit-Moor. The important thing about the Great Forest is that it would be a Druidic center point, because they always practiced at the center points of territories and in the spaces between tribal territories. This is a meeting of a few different tribal areas. So this is a close-up of the Great Forest. And you'll see there are 4 rivers They come out of it like the Garden of Eden, and they go north, south, east, and west, and they always have done since Bronze Age and before. So older than any legends of Glastonbury are the hills and the River Brue. The River Brue really important because it comes out of the Great Forest and flows past Wiriel Hill and out to Breen Down. Now, the important thing with that is from a Druidic or a Celtic mindset, the west, where the sun sets, it's even in Lord of the Rings, the Dying Lands and the Golden Realms in the west and stuff, but the west is the direction of the spirit world. So where the sun goes down, it's where symbolically souls go after this life. They go to the west. So if you have the notion of King Arthur being taken to Avalon on a boat or a barge, it can only be on the River Brue. There's no other river to Glastonbury, Avalon. So it's interesting that this west-flowing river flows to that sacred hilltop in the Avalon Glastonbury landscape. It's in the west from the Great Forest. This map shows little, these are temples, and these are little houses, what we call Roman villas. And gradually over the last 150 years, plenty of archaeology of the mosaic floors and the iconography in the mosaic floors, and evidence of what gods and goddesses were acknowledged in these temples. So for instance, this temple here, which is at the source of the River Wylye, the Wylye gives its name to Wiltshire. Cold Kitchen Hill is the name of the temple. Metal detectorists found this lovely thing. She's tiny, that's my drawing of her. She's only a small ornament, but she's acknowledged as a Maenad. Now the Maenads were the followers of the god Bacchus. Bacchus is the Roman equivalent of Dionysus. So in the north of the Great Forest, in Roman times for a few hundred years, there were mystery rites of Dionysus because she's there to say so. And she was just found by metal detectorists detecting the temple at Cold Kitchen Hill. So the focus for this talk then is going to be from the source of the River Brue, and it goes through a couple of places called North Brewham, South Brewham to Bruton. They're all named after the River Brue. And the first temple is Lamiot Beacon. Then it comes to Glastonbury Tor. I'm going to talk about the Roman temple on the Tor. And then the River Brue used to go out to Breen Down. Breen Down is really important. Dion Fortune book, The Sea Priestess, was based on the temple at the end of Breen Down. Nowadays, the River Brue comes out at Burnham-on-Sea because in the 1200s, the monks of the abbey redirected the river when they were draining the levels to create more grazing ground for sheep and stuff, But originally, the Brue went from the Great Forest to Breen Down. That's its original route. So this is the actual source of the River Brue. It's on the west side of a National Trust property called Stour Head, which is only been called Stour Head since the 1700s, but it goes way, 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 way back. Of course, there's an area nearby where there was a Neolithic settlement, and there's hundreds of tumuli there that have been dug up, sadly, and stuff, but it's an ancient area and a tribal meeting place.
What does Stour mean then?
So Stour is one of the four rivers. Okay. So that the Brue goes west, the River Frome goes north, the Wylye goes east and gives its name to Wiltshire, and the Stour goes down through Dorset. And the property is at the source of the River Stour, so they call it Stour Head because of that river. Yeah, that's right. From here in the woods at Stour Head, it's that wide, of course, and then more streams add to it and it gets bigger and bigger. And by the time you get to South Brewham and Bruton, it's a proper river. It comes out here at Breen Down. Now, the important thing then is that in the distance, you can see Wales, South Wales, and you've got Steepholm Island Flatholm Island, and the Severn Estuary. That was Glastonbury's connection to the Celtic sea trade. And I'll show you a map of that in a minute. So if Arthur came to Glastonbury by boat, he either has to come from the Bruton area on a barge from the Salisbury Plain, Wiltshire kind of area to Glastonbury, or comes in at Breandown again to go upriver to Glastonbury. It's the only way here by boat. You know. Here is the Celtic sea trade. So Glastonbury is here. And we know from the Iron Age lake village here that they were well connected. They had glass beads from Scotland. And, you know, the trading routes connected to mainland Europe since the Bronze Age. You know, so the idea of Joseph of Arimathea being a tin trader, the tin trading's been going on for thousands of years. You know, so it was a well-known thing. Julius Caesar, quite a Hitler, and but as monstrous as he was when he destroyed the Celts, he was quite clever as well. There was this one tribe, the Veneti, and they had all of these amazing ships to deal with the Atlantic Ocean. The ships were made out of solid oak tree trunks, and instead of rope rigging, the rigging was iron chains and big leather sails to cope with the rough sea and the rough clipped coastline. Eventually, Caesar destroyed them, and he dragged all of their ships around to here, and he used their ships to invade Britain. Horrible, clever, horrible, you know, fascinating. So Glastonbury and the River Brue were the ancient connection to Europe through the sea trade. And this is the island of Glastonbury, or its old name, Brythonic name, Uniswitrin, which simply means the Isle of Glass. Unis is island, Witrin, glass. Glass Isle, Isle of Glass. And you can see the River Brue working its way around here. So you'll get used to the shape. Glastonbury never was a complete island. It was more of a peninsula. So it's connected here by the road called the A361, goes through West Pennard. But there's an earthwork called Pontus Ball, and that kind of creates a wall and makes the whole island a kind of sanctuary or an enclosed area, an unis, an innis, insula. It will be significant, of course. So that's an introduction to the Brue itself. Now, coming back to the Roman temples that are known about, the first thing to get your head around is they're not Roman. We call them Roman temples because they're from Romano-British times. And although the Romans did their best to wipe out Druidism and Druids, the people were allowed to carry on worshipping the gods and goddesses that they were familiar with. So they took the political power of the Druids away. But with the local gods and goddesses, the Romans just reinterpreted it. So, for instance, a well-known one is Bath, where the goddess of the sacred waters in Bath is called Sul, or Sulis. And the Romans equated her with Minerva, female, mother goddess there. So when we're looking at the Romano-Celtic temples, it's just a facelift of what was already going on, you know. So just briefly then, the first temple on the Brue, Lamiot Beacon, these are some of the figurines that were found there. There's nothing there now. There's not even remains to go and look at. They've been totally removed. So all that's left is what archaeologists can dig. But it gives you an idea of what was going on for 400 years. Now, the way a Roman temple or Romano-Celtic temple works is there's a central bit and the main tower, if you like, be like a church steeple. And inside there was a statue of a god or goddess. So it might be Apollo or Minerva or Mercury, and they'd be the main god or goddess for that temple. But around that, there was a corridor, like a circular corridor, which they called a perambulatory. And in the perambulatory, there's lots of different altars. So there was one main god or goddess, but there were shrines to lots of different gods and goddesses. So you could go there, it didn't matter what god or goddess you wanted to worship or give thanks to or pray to, you could do it at any of these temples. So there was a main figurehead and then a perambulatory. So these figurines are from all the various shrines, you know. Now here's an interesting thing then, is around Lamiot Beacon, they found lots of buried antlers, which I'll come back to, because they also found antlers buried at Breen Down. But just quickly, these were also found at Lamiot Beacon, and then lovely because these are very Roman looking, these are very Celtic looking. It was a hybrid temple, and these are little brooches, no bigger than that, of Celtic warriors on horses, and they have red and blue enamel on them. And the legend of Gwyn ap Neath being on the tour with St. Colin, the men at arms of Gwyn ap Neath all wear red and blue. And it's lovely that there's red and blue enamel on these Celtic horsemen. So, with Lamiot Beacon and the antlers that were buried around, there were quite a few figurines of Mars, war god. And so the archaeologists, the academic point of view was, well, it's a temple of Mars, warriors, and there's all these antlers. So it probably was to a Cernunnos type hunter god. That's their speculation. All they've got is the antlers, and I'll come back to that and suggest it's a goddess later on. But who's Cernunnos then? Very quickly, Cernunnos here is an antler-headed god. This is a statue from 3rd century Gaul, part of the Romano-Celtic world. But one of his key symbols, iconography, is down at the bottom is a bull and a stag. Now, theoretically, the bull represents the summertime and the stag represents the wintertime, the two halves of the year. The bull is a domesticated animal. It's the tractor for ploughing the fields and so on, and it represents farming culture and agriculture. The stag, on the other hand, is a wild animal, and it represents the winter time because it's in the winter time you go hunting. So it's the symbol of the winter provision of food, as opposed to farming being the summer provision of food. You don't go hunting in the summertime because you don't want to go hunting over your crops. And in the wintertime, the trees are all bare, so it's easier to see your prey in the forest. So that's why they kind of represent two halves of the year. So symbolically then, the antlers are a symbol for the wintertime, and that's really important. And the bull's horns are a symbol for the summertime. On the Gunderstrup Cauldron from Denmark, thousands of miles away from where the Cernunnos statue in Gaul comes from, there's Cernunnos with a stag and a bull. So it's Celtic culture across Europe, but using the same symbolism. So again, going back to Lamiot Beacon and it being the temple of a Cernunnos type hunter god, these are a glimpse at what archaeology is suggesting. Now, I'll come to it further on, but in modern paganism, from the 1980s onwards, there has been the phenomena of Elen of the Ways, this antler-headed goddess. And critics would say she's not ancient, she doesn't go way back, but I've got some evidence to show you that she is as old as Cernunnos. But simplistically, she's a goddess of the land, the wild places, and as goddess of the ways, it's the ley lines and underwater streams and spirit paths and song lines and all those things, you know. So anyone that does a lot of questing, it's quite common that Elen will turn up. You know, if you pay attention to the land, if you care about the land, and you're interested in restoring the wasteland and healing the land, Elen will often be a first point of contact. You know, In the Arthurian stories, she's known as the Empress. In the Mabinogion story of her, when the Roman Emperor first sees her, Maxen Fledig, he says, oh, Empress of Rome. And from that onwards, Elen is known as the Empress. And in the Arthurian stories, her main treasures are this magical chessboard and the white hart, the white stag is her main treasure of the Empress. So years ago, 2007, I did a book on Gwyn at Neath, which is the local legend for Glastonbury Tor. And in it, I looked at the old stuff. And here's a thing, and some of this niggles me, and it still does, even after all these years. Every single archaeological dig done in Glastonbury has shown Roman remains. You have to get your head around that. So the Romans were here in the 1st century. Roman roof tiles, Roman pottery. There's even a Roman way because there was a Roman jetty on the River Brue and so on. But that is still unplayed or kept fairly quiet. In 2001, local archaeologists, Charles and Nancy Hollinrake, did a survey for the National Trust, giving the evidence of a Romano-Celtic temple on top of Glastonbury Tor. You can see it here, this circular area is where they suggest the archaeology says there was a circular temple. This bit here is the current tower. So all we can go by is the circular foundation. So projecting upwards, you can see the ghost of the present tower there. And how high the Roman temple is anyone's guess, but that's its width. And you can see sketched in people kind of 6 foot high. That's a 6 foot person, give you an idea of the size of the thing. Now, think of this, the top of the Tor first had some Saxon churches on it. And then the Saxon churches were pushed away and the Normans built a stone church. And then that stone church got destroyed by an earthquake. So they built another church. So there was Saxon activity, 2 lots of Norman building on top of a rather small hilltop summit. In the 1960s, the archaeologists still found Roman pottery and Roman roof tiles. After all of that activity, that was still there. There's the River Brue. There's Brent Knoll. Brent Knoll, known to be a fire beacon site. The Tor would have been a fire beacon site. Ships going on the Brue. There's Wiriel Hill. There's Higham. Even today, so 2001 is when Charles and Nancy Hollinrake did their survey for the National Trust. At the foot of the Tor, 22 years later, the information boards do not even say that there may have been a temple on the Tor. That annoys me. I can't help it. I get niggled by that. So I did a book to show the evidence about it and explore it, really, you know. Like I say, they're pretty standard across the board. There's a central god or goddess in the middle and a perambulatory with other shrines. I put antlers there just because there were antlers found at Lamiot Beacon and at Breen Down. Now, here's a thing then. As I showed with the bull being an animal symbolic of the summertime and the stag being symbolic of the wintertime, there's a wonderful phenomena in Glastonbury that at the winter solstice, the sun rises up the slopes of Glastonbury Tor. And it's perfect. I have witnessed it. I think it was 2006. More often than not, it's cloudy and there's nothing to see, you know. But from a certain mound on St Edmund's Hill, you can watch the sun roll up the Tor. So winter solstice phenomena to a temple. It would have gone into the Roman temple there, you know. Now, to view it, you have to be on St Edmund's Hill and the sun will roll up the Tor to here. And that phenomena can be witnessed from the Iron Age lake village as well. So that winter time, winter solstice emphasis is fascinating on an island that's part of a river thing where the antlers are being left at temples, the animal of the winter time. For whatever reason, no conspiracy theories, but the location of the original old church is out of sight of the tour. So we just will do it here, for whatever reasons, make of it what you will. So I did this in a bed and breakfast in Glastonbury. It's a picture of Gwyn at Neath. So the stories of Gwyn at Neath are all about winter time, otherworld rites, really. It corresponds with a constellation, Orion the Hunter, which is the winter constellation. And throughout the winter months, from the Market Cross or the Iron Age Lake Village, Orion comes out of Glastonbury tour and goes hunting across the night sky at the winter time. So if the constellation of the winter hunter comes out the tour, he must live in the tour, so the stories have grown from that kind of idea. Gwyn at Neath has a battle every Beltane with a character called Gwythyr ap Grydal. It's a summer king, winter king battle. And in the Welsh tradition, King Arthur has 3 queens, and all 3 queens are called Guinevere. And one of the 3 Guineveres is the daughter of Gwythyr ap Grydal. She's the daughter of the summer king. So the Gwyn thing has a relationship to the Guinevere story in Wales. So back to Elen then. She is mentioned in the Mabinogion. She is a Welsh goddess as valid as Rhiannon and Arianrhod and so on. But what the Mabinogion doesn't say is that she has antlers. That's a modern thing, largely, or that's what people have said. It's not true, of course. So going back to 3rd century Gaul, the Celtic times, Romano-Celtic times, at the same time as the Canunus effigies, there are goddesses with antlers. It is a thing, So for whatever reason, this goddess figure is wearing the animal totem of the winter time. She's not wearing bull's horns, so she's a winter time goddess, With that, you could get into the kayak and Bridie and Brigid coming through to Imbolc and stuff, but she's got the horns of the winter time. And the mythology of her can be traced right back to ancient times with the ancient deer trods through Siberia and to the Sami people and things like that. After the last great ice age, the deer goddess was the main thing in Europe. And I would argue that any winter king or summer king wanting to marry the goddess of the land is going to put on a headdress for her. So Canunus is wearing the headdress of the winter king consort to the goddess. If she's a deer goddess, he needs antlers. Here's a thing then. So the River Brue is here in the Great Forest, goes to Lamiot Beacon, where there were the lovely horseman brooches and the stag's antlers. Glastonbury Tor, with its winter solstice alignment and legends of Gwyn at Neath and Roman pottery and Roman roof tiles. To Breen Down, which also had stag's antlers buried, and they think it was a goddess, a temple to Brigid, Brigid, stroke Minerva to the Romans, but Brigid. The whole Bristol Channel is Brigid, with St. Bride's Bay at the far end, and even the town of Bristol is Brigstow, Bridie's town stuff. Quite wonderfully, from the end of the last ice age, so about 11,000 BC or so, they found loads of reindeer bones at Breen Down. So it's not proof, of course, but it's suggestive of a deer cult, whether it's Canunus or Elen, a kind of river culture celebrating the winter time with the antlers and stuff. Won't go into it too much, but a fascinating thing too is the River Brue with the Glastonbury zodiac. The River Brue goes through the 6 zodiac signs of the wintertime, and the River Carey goes through the 6 zodiac signs of the summertime. But the River Brue is going through all the winter signs in the Glastonbury zodiac. A bit of fun. Now, look here, Caerleon. The next picture is Caerleon. So this is Wales. In the Mabinogion, Elen, who becomes Empress of Rome when she marries the Emperor, it's a story of Rome taking over the control of Wales by claiming the sovereignty goddess of Wales. And for the marriage, she asks the Emperor to do her a marriage gift, and she asks that he builds her 3 towns, 3 cities, if you like. And they are Caerleon, Carmarthen, Carnarvon. They were famous places where there were Roman forts and legionaries and stuff. Their Roman names are Isca, Moradunum, Saguntium. Now, if you work out the triangle of those 3 places, which is easy to do, you can work out the centre of that triangle. And the centre of that triangle is the heart of Wales, and it's a place called Elenith, which means Elen's land. So this being one of Elen's cities is not far away from the whole dear goddess route of the River Brue. So I got looking at Elen, and I got trying to think about, there's something missing, that there's something else that I'm not quite getting. And I went back to the archaeology of Chalicewell. And the archaeologist of Chalicewell was a guy called Philip Ratz. And he did the archaeology in the 60s on the summit of the Tor as well. And when he did archaeology at Chalicewell, he found the stumps of ancient yew trees. And he makes a passing reference that yew groves were sacred to the goddess Hecate. Now, up on the Mendips, there's another pagan temple on a place called Pagan's Hill, and that's got a yew grove as well. And I know at the centre of the Glastonbury Zodiac, there's a yew grove at Parkwood. And it just kept niggling in the back of my head. I thought, well, who would be the Celtic Hecate? Hecate's a Greek goddess. And the Romans actually called her Diana Triformis. It means 3-formed Diana. And Diana, more often than not, is depicted with deer. She's like Elen, she's a spirit of the forests as opposed to the waters. She's the forest, and the animals of the forest. She protects the forest. Now, the Romano-Celtic goddess that I think would be Hecate is Nemetona. And there's an inscription to Nemetona in Bath. It's not that far away. It's less than 30 miles away. And Nemetona is a name and not a name. It simply means she of the sacred grove. So the divine feminine of the sacred grove. She of the sacred grove. That's what Nemetona means. So it's the divine feminine of the sacred forest, if you like. So that's Diana. The word Nemetona or Nemeton, a Nemeton is where Druids would gather and teach their wisdoms. If you think of a grove as being like a church, a Nemeton is a cathedral. It's like a bigger grove, if you like, where they would have big gatherings. And their main figurehead would be she of the sacred grove. Now, in the classical world, there's a famous grove at Lake Nemi. It's a grove to Diana, and all the shrines of Diana had stags' heads and antlers around them. Again, Diana with a stag. So this would be the Roman equivalent of Hecate, equivalent of Nemetona. Now, statues of Hecate or Diana Triformis. She's also known as Trivia. It looks like the word trivia, But trivia means three ways, like via is a route, you know. And she was often three figures in one, like the Holy Trinity, and she was often where three roads came together. And so you've got a choice of three ways, or trivia. Come back to Elenith and Elen's towns, and the roads that connect them are still called San Elen, but from Elenith there's going to be three routes to her three ways, you know. That has got that, you know, triple goddesses is such a Celtic phenomena anyway. Now, here's a lovely thing. This is a map of Somerset done in the 1600s. It's from a book called Polyolbion. And all of the rivers are little naked ladies. They're actually water nymphs. They're the eternal spirits of the rivers, or they're the well maidens. They're the divine feminine of those waters, is what they are, you know. So even in the 1600s, they were remembering that. And I've got another map in a minute to say it clearer. It says there the Isle of Avalon, and that's the River Brue. Here it's spelt B-R-Y, Bry. But apart from the river goddesses, the main goddess here, where the Brue comes from, is this Dianic figure, an Artemis figure with a bow and arrow. So there's the River Wylie, where you had the Maenads and the Dionysus temple, and then the River Brue flowing to the Isle of Avalon here. So up until the 1620s, that kind of Diana or goddess of the woodlands thing is remembered in the landscape. And I would argue it's still there today. From working with the landscape, dreaming with the landscape, it's still singing this Dianic, Elen, Nemetona song. So even today at Stourhead, there's this temple called the Pantheon. You can go to it today, it's there. And one of the 7 statues is Diana, is still there, still honoured at the source of these 4 rivers that flow north, south, east and west. And Glastonbury, Unis Witrin, Avalon is the West River, the direction of the other world. You know, you go down a river and there's the Tor, you know, and you can carry on taking the funeral barge to Breen Down. So I haven't got any with me. You can get this on Amazon. There's a small booklet about everything I've talked about with more information. And there's a massive book with 700 pages all about Gwyn at Meath. Thank you. Did I? I was nervous.
Three minutes.
3 minutes.
So any questions? Yeah.
Hello, it's more of an observation. What I'd really like to share it with you, if I may. The map you showed of the woodland, of the old woodland, and its position, so below Bath and through. So at the moment there is a raging campaign. It's the quarries basically. So the whole of that area where that woodland was at Mass Forest has been quarried mercilessly since the Second World War. And we're fighting this campaign at the moment, which is so Ashen Wood is the last ancient woodland on Mendes, really. And they're trying to basically break this corridor to split the wood in half, to split the woods in half. And it's actually the hydrology that is really been calling out the most. So there is still the ancient yews in those woods that are amazing. There's actually an ancient yew grove near the Watley Quarry. But where we're doing is the hydrology. So the water that's being, that will be kind of sucked in is where we're mostly kind of focusing. That's the thing that's been calling the most, I think, to do with this. But yeah, and the springs around that area as well are tremendous. So,
it reminds me of fracking a little bit. You know, fracking has the potential of changing the underground water streams and the directions they flow. So famous wells like Channel could dry up. If the water is re-diverted, it doesn't come through anymore. stuff, so you're contaminating the water sources. Yeah, monstrous. It's interesting how it goes back to the sacredness of the well maidens, which is a metaphor for the streams and the ponds and the waterfalls and all the rest of them.
Yeah, no, thank you. We go back and do walks, and I'll put that more intention in there, so thank you.
I think not only does water hold memory, it will talk to you, and you can re-love it and call it forth, definitely.
There seems to be
Speak up for people at the
there
back.
seems to be quite a correspondence between what happened to the well maidens and the theft of the gold in the Rheingold story, which starts Farman's Ringside one, and what happens there, and all the catastrophes that follow from the gold being stolen from the Rhine and Rhine maidens.
Underlying the Welsh story about the Mabinogion of Elen is the desire for Welsh gold. And the Romans went straight into the gold mines and took as much as they could from the area where the Cassini stones come from.
Rose gold as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's almost the lifeblood of the land in a way, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it represents male greed to rape and take and do.
And all the disasters that follow those.
Yeah. It is a raping, just like fracking is literally a raping, isn't it? Even in Irish story, I found this out much later, there's a story of the Druidic deities, and the god Lu turns up to help them defeat the Fomorians, who the bad guys are, and he asks various members of the Druidic what they can do to help to fight the Fomorians. And there's some well maidens, and he says, what can you do to help fight the Fomorians? And they say, we'll take our golden cups away, and they will have nowhere to drink. It's remembered in different stories.
Yeah. And actually that reminds me also of, on a more mundane level, of what happened when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. And when he was getting near to St. Petersburg, General Kutuzov said to the Russian people, burn the land, retreat, let him have the buildings of St. Petersburg, but waste the land, so that he would not be able to have any crops and no. So they, in a sense, the Russian people took their gold and went somewhere else, and the land was wasted.
Two things. In the 1200s, when most of the King Arthur stories are written, there really was a wasteland, because there had been in England a civil war between Stephen and Matilda, and they had all these modern baby castles everywhere. And the way of destroying a castle wasn't to fight, it was to burn all the agriculture around it, and the people died of starvation. So they literally were scorching the earth around all these modern baby castles, so you really did have a wasteland with no crops or anything.
When you said that the Grail Maidens were more entities at the springs, do you think that there were also women there that embodied those entities, individuals?
Absolutely, yeah. I think lots of temple life scenarios, priests and priestesses, are vessels for divine forces.
Another question?
So there's a bit of a technical question. The Hollingrex archaeology on the tour, what was their attitude towards the previous archaeology that had been done by Rats and so on? Were they bullying on that? Because they would have had to go over the same ground.
Yeah, so back in the 60s when Rats did it, Nancy was a student archaeologist. She was there with Rats, and then many decades later, she and her husband put the survey to the National Trust.
So when you say survey, did they had a new dig that they did? Or?
No, she was going on the maps from the 1960s.
Okay, so she was reworking what had been done.
Looking over what had been looked at. And another thing they found on the top of the tour, and it is a tour phenomenon, you do find them, is ammonites around. But what Philip Ross found was piles of them, like 400 in a pile, like they'd been left as offerings or something. And that's a known thing in Gaul, that ammonites are left as offerings as well. So that was, as well as the Roman roof tiles and pottery, that made Nancy think this is a place of sacredness,
So then I suppose the next question is, what was then, did Rats was he ever able to hear this interpretation by his students, and then what was his attitude towards that? Because that might be why it's not being taken up, because in the fight between Rats and his student, I think the mainstream academia is probably sided with Rats, and then I don't know if he had opportunity to comment on it.
I think it had to be very political, and I don't want to get into the conspiracy theory of it, but he went on to do other Roman pagan temples.
Sure,
Like Pagan Hill, so that was his influence. But when he did the tour survey over 3 years, he was financed by Chalice Well Trust and something else, I can't remember, it was some American financial body, and they were looking for evidence of first century Christian activity, and he didn't find any, and disappointed, they pulled the plug on it. So that just folded. But I think politically he didn't want to upset anybody either. So in his own books, he's just saying Roman stuff's found at every dig, and then he'd jump forward and say Christianity has been there, blah, 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 stuff. But there's a lot of gaps, but politeness and politics.
There's an article in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, I observed that the archaeology map of the tour, that the old temple and the church tower kind of formed like a vesture of Pisces.
Yeah.
And also that the square tower formed like a circle square with as a kind of vesture of Pisces. Have you noticed that?
For sure.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Isn't it? There must have been some relationship there.
The Romans put temples where Celts had shrines, and then the early church put churches where there were Roman temples, and it's like sacred sites get reused and reused and reused.
But I didn't know it would have been that precise that it.
Yeah. And actually, the tower as it is today, when you walk up to it, that's the front door, and where the plateau is, where the silver disc is, that would have been the body of the church.
Yeah.
So where the body of the church would have been is where the round temple would have been. So they're always, theoretically, before the Roman temple, there was a Celtic shrine made of stones and wood or something. That the hilltop has always been special.
And there is a crossing of ley lines right in the middle of that circular temple, the old temple as well. People know about.
And like saying with tours, hilltop, the pinnacle of a moor will draw all the energy to it. So Glastonbury tour does that for the levels. It just draws everything. It's the pyramid of the levels, isn't it?
Obviously, we're familiar with the way within the Celtic world broadly, we get the tales from Ireland and Wales, and then move down into this area and onto Brittany. And clearly, Glastonbury legends sort of soaked them up and assimilated them. But given, I'll probably have to read your book about Gwyn, but given that you've gone into that a lot, I wondered how you felt about Gwyn, because there is some discussion in Glastonbury about the extent to which Gwyn is a sort of Welsh import on a native spirit. And I'm just interested how you feel about when that happens. Obviously, the Romans did it as well.
Yeah.
How you feel that alters the vibration or the particular relationship.
And you're totally right and fair to say that. So the local legend of Gwyn and St. Collins from the 1500s. It's not old. However, the phenomena of the winter hunter as a star law thing, a seasonal repeat that happens year after year after year, is the origin of Canunus and the Canunus figure on the Gunderstruck cauldron. So more often, I love the legend of Gwyn at Neath, but I have moved on, and I usually just say the winter hunter now. And Gwyn is a local echo of it, Yeah, so a rose by any other name is still a rose, and the winter hunter is the winter hunter. So Peter's work on the Cernabus giant is the winter hunter. It does do that, plays that out, And the importance of that is Gwyn and the wild hunt being a psychopomp to the next world, and the winter hunter constellation pointing to the Stargate where the sun's ecliptic and Milky Way cross, So that wasn't lost on the ancient Druids. They understood star law like that, and the seasonal stargates and things. Yeah. So Gwyn is a late echo of those ideas.
So you, for example, in working with Gwyn, you don't think that's necessarily hugely significant, as you say, by any other name. You don't think that certain figures perhaps have qualities
I
that.
think if you look at Irish and Welsh stories, there's quite a few Gwyns by other names, i.e. that there's quite a few otherworld winter hunters, whether it's, the stories are there, and that duality of Winter King and Summer King was played out there.
Guinevere.
Yeah.
Gwyn means the shining, isn't it?
So it goes back to King Arthur again. So is King Arthur a real man that's buried at Glastonbury Abbey? On the other hand, in Welsh lore, he arranges that Gwyn and Gwythyr have this battle every Beltane until doom. Hang on a moment, they're gods, and this is a man, so it's funny, and yet Guinevere is a daughter of the Summer King. So there's a real garbled thing between the stories and the star lore and legend and history. So I think that the Arthurian legends of the 1200s and 1300s are a Christian mysticism retelling of older Celtic things.
We don't need, he refers to his father.
Needs his father.
But there's a temple to his father nearby as well in South Wales.
Temple
Lyddon, exactly. Yeah. So the proximity of that makes it kind of.
Yeah.
We've got another question.
Did I hear you say that Brigid is the same as Sulis and Minerva?
So when the Romans do their thing, the archaeologists call it interpretatio Romana. So they look at a Celtic god or goddess and say, oh, Apollo or Minerva or whatever. So many Celtic goddesses just get called Minerva. So Brigantia in northern Britain has a helmet, a shield, and a spear, just like Minerva. She's depicted in that way because they Romanized it. But the important thing is they haven't erased it. It says Brigantia, is what it says. And equally in Bath, it says Nemetona, which is the same as Arnemetia in Buxton. This Nemetona keeps popping up, she of the Sacred Grove. And when the Elen stuff started coming through with psychics in the 1980s, she was Elen of the Ways, she was just a green woman, and that's evolved over the last 3 or 4 decades. Now Elen of the Ways is a dynamic flush of something on the other world. There's a problem, I think, with a lot of modern day Druidism, that they look back to the Mabinogion and other things, and they're almost role-playing something in the past that was written down in the 1200s, and they're not comfortable with the other world talking right now. What's coming through right now? What are the intuitive people and the psychics picking up right now? Because the other world is outside of time. It's not in the 13th century, but you have to do your research and all the rest of it as well, But it's still there, it's still singing. So it's almost like with the work of Peter and Sue, it's dreaming with the land and listening with the land and hearing it again. You can't come in until you sing a song. You make that heart connection, which is just empathy. And the places hold memory. Those well maidens are still there.
One quick last question.
Where was the temple again? You had a picture of a temple, white, dome, somewhere close by. Where was that?
Stourhead. It's on the border between Somerset and Wiltshire.
Okay.
And it's a National Trust property.
And that's where the rivers start, is it the 4 rivers?
All 4 rivers come out of their territory. So Stourhead estate's quite vast, hundreds of acres. And all 4 rivers go from that one area to the southeast of
Did you go there and visit?
Yeah. They have to pay a bit of money. National Trust. If you remember, you can go for free. So I don't know what the
10, 15 quid or something.
Yeah, it's not hundreds of pounds.
No, you can do it. Make it a day trip. You'd be prepared to pay.
Were you sneaking, working out?
Yeah, there are unofficial routes.
Yes.
Yep, go on.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment or a question that mentioned Stourhead. I wanted to refer to Richard Colt Hall. Now, he was born at Stourhead, and the Hall family ancestrally
are part of that landscape. And it was this man that was involved in the 19th century as an antiquarian, digging up mounds and exploring and taking skeletons from the Wiltshire Salisbury Plain landscape, that also purchased Glastonbury Tor and funded the restoration of the St Michael Chapel. So were it not for, so we've got that connection with Stour Head, the exploration of the antiquarians, and the Tor, and that would not be, as it is now, restored for the nation. And I think that's quite significant.
Yeah, the Tor used to belong to the man who lived at Stour Head. It's mad, isn't it? Yeah. I've got this hill with a tower on it.
God, one quick last question, Hugh.
The pagan temple on top of the Tor, there is underneath it there are caves, the entrance to caves, right near the summit, I'm given to understand. Would that not be worthy of investigation to see if there were underworld rites going on there, Mithraean rites going on in the temple?
Absolutely.
The Boy That Could Be King, the film, they went through the two slabs of stone in the centre of the tower, and Hela was underneath, the goddess of the underworld.
You know, Jeff Stray has done a book about all the underground tunnels, so he's probably
I don't know
got.
if he's addressed that on the top of the tour, though.
Yeah, cool.
All right, thank you very much, Yuri.
Thanks.